Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, do any of you chooms remember Mark Montagna? For those who don't know, first of all, let me give you my heartfelt apologies for making you aware of his existence. Anyways, he's the conspiracy theorist who runs this website, which was originally called finasterideinfo.org, which is now known as Finasteride Watch. Here on this website, on his computer desk, is where Mr. Montagna spends literally all of his time doing nothing except collecting and sharing anti-finasteride research that he doesn't understand since he's mad that he can't use the drug himself. He also goes by the name Rinkmaster on Reddit, and you can see that he spent the last several years doing pretty much nothing but sharing whatever anti-finasteride research and opinion pieces he can possibly find. He is one of the most fanatically anti-finasteride bloggers on the entire internet, so just imagine if Dr. Trash were a high school dropout, and you'll kind of get the picture. He even wrote a 50-page thesis a couple of years ago where he tried to come up with his own BS theory about finasteride and persistent side effects. He even had the audacity to compare his plight to the persecution of the Renaissance astronomer Galileo. This is as pretentious as sin, because nobody is persecuting Mark Montagna. It's just that nobody takes his bullshit seriously because he's a scientifically illiterate moron who has no business discussing the subjects he's talking about. And that's the exact opposite of Galileo, who was definitely a pioneer in his field of science. I made a video where I scientifically dismantled his 50-page thesis, and to this day, I still haven't heard him try to defend his paper from any of my very valid criticisms, which you can view for yourself since I'll link the video below. I think his real reason for never responding is probably because he can't. From what I understand, he hasn't even brought up his thesis again since I debunked it over 2 years ago. Other than the thesis he wrote, Mr. Montagna almost never actually tries to make an analysis or break down any of the scientific research that he's presenting. All he ever does is he just scours the internet all day for whatever anti-finasteride blog, opinion piece, or rat study he can possibly find that speaks negatively about finasteride, and he then shares it, and he expects us to just accept it at face value because he's too lazy and ignorant to provide any kind of scientific breakdown of anything he shares. He doesn't care about the veracity or the quality of the data he shares. Literally, the only criteria that matters to him at all is that it confirms his bitter views about finasteride and other 5-AR inhibiting drugs. This guy has been around for a while, but other than my original video debunking his thesis, I haven't given him much attention because, quite frankly, he's a pipsqueak. What he usually does is he goes on Reddit where he'll periodically post some weak anti-finasteride study or opinion piece, and then after he gets debunked, he'll go back to lurking for a few weeks before doing it all over again. So, despite Mr. Montagna's pathological hatred for finasteride, he has failed miserably in his feeble attempts to gaslight it. So, I feel I don't even need to use my platform to call out his bullshit since he always gets laughed out of the room whenever he tries to make an argument, and then he goes to cry on about how he's persecuted like Galileo. However, one of my viewers recently brought something he wrote on his website to my attention. Normally, I wouldn't waste my time responding to any of his posts, but in this particular case, I felt it was a good opportunity to discuss some interesting research about the safety profile of finasteride. Even though this research was published 7 or 8 years ago, apparently Mr. Montagna just discovered its existence because he published his response to the research just a couple of weeks ago. The research is on the incidence of side effects from finasteride and dutasteride, and it was published as 3 separate papers, so you can almost consider them a trilogy of some sort. The 3 studies all have the same authors, and they are all based on a database from the United Kingdom called the UK Clinical Practice Research Datalink. All 3 of the studies use the same methodology. The 3 studies examine the effects of finasteride on the risk of erectile dysfunction, the risk of depression, and the risk of gynecomastia. So, Mr. Montagna posted responses to 2 of the 3 articles on his website. One response was to the article on the incidence of erectile dysfunction with finasteride, and the other response was to the article on the incidence of depression with finasteride. It is noteworthy that he didn't respond to the article on the risk of gynecomastia with finasteride, even though it used the exact same methodology as the other articles. I'm guessing that this is probably because the gynecomastia article showed an association between 5-AR blocker use and gynecomastia, which fits his narrative and shows how manipulative and agenda-driven Mr. Montagna is. However, as we'll soon see, the other 2 articles did not show an association between finasteride and either erectile dysfunction or depression. So, since this doesn't fit Mr. Montagna's narrative, suddenly he has major issues with the research. This is what what I was talking about earlier. The only metric this guy uses to determine a good study versus a bad study is whether or not it fits his confirmation bias. So if a study says something good about finasteride, it is a bad study. But if it says something bad about the drug, then it is a good study. Literally nothing else matters to Mr. Montagna. He's on a crusade to destroy finasteride once and for all, and like hell is he going to let something like scientific research get in his way. As it turns out, though, Mr. Montagna's criticism of the articles are not even his own criticism. He copied them from a doctor named Dr. Richard Brown, who raised identical objections back in October of 2016, just after the erectile dysfunction article came out. The authors respond to these objections, and we'll go over all that in a moment, but first, let's take a look at the articles that got Mr. Montagna so hot under the collar. The first study published in the trilogy is this one here, published in 2016. The subjects from this article and the other articles all come from the United Kingdom. Like most civilized countries besides the United States, the UK has a socialized medicine system run by the government. As part of this system, there is an electronic medical record called the UK Clinical Practice Research Datalink, also known as the CPRD. This database contains data on approximately 10 million people, at least at the time these articles were written. The data is anonymous and it is just for research purposes. General practitioners in the United Kingdom submit data on medical diagnoses, lifestyle details like smoking and body mass index, causes of death, and details of all prescribed drugs. The study examined all the records in the database from 1992, which was the year finasteride was first approved for medical use, up to 2011. It's probably a good thing that the study ended in 2011 because it was around that time that the concept of post-finasteride syndrome began spreading through the internet like wildfire. This would have contaminated the database with a bunch of people experiencing nocebo effects due to fear-mongering in social media. So the study looked at two separate groups of men treated with 5-AR blockers. The first group were men with a diagnosis of benign prostatic hyperplasia, also known as BPH, and the second group of men had a diagnosis of androgenic alopecia. To identify men with BPH, the men had to either had a diagnosis of BPH or prostatism, and they had to be on a 5-AR inhibiting drug, meaning finasteride or dutasteride, or they are on an alpha-blocking drug like tamsulosin. Alpha-blocking drugs like tamsulosin are not 5-AR inhibitors, and they don't stop hair loss. They work on the prostate by blocking part of the autonomic nervous system that controls the muscles around the prostate and the bladder, which makes it easier to pee. Of course, 5-AR blockers like finasteride and dutasteride actually decrease the trash hormone DHT, and this causes the enlarged prostate to shrink in size. However, it's important to realize that everyone in the BPH group was on some drug for BPH, either a 5-AR inhibitor or an alpha blocker drug, or a combination of the two drugs. All these men had to have at least 3 years of medical records before starting these drugs and no prior history of sexual dysfunction. They also all had to be over the age of 40. The other part of the study looked at men with alopecia. These men all had to have a diagnosis of alopecia made between 2002 and 2011. These men were all between 18 and 59 years of age. So you can see from the first chart here that the investigators started out with 115,443 subjects with BPH, and after excluding subjects that didn't qualify, they ended up with 71,849 subjects. Out of this group, 5,768 subjects had a diagnosis of erectile dysfunction. These cases of erectile dysfunction were compared to subjects that didn't have erectile dysfunction. For the alopecia subjects, they started out with 29,228 subjects with a diagnosis of alopecia. 16,682 subjects were excluded because for various reasons, as you can see in this chart here. Of the 12,346 subjects remaining, 547 developed erectile dysfunction during the study period, and they were compared to 2,178 subjects without erectile dysfunction. In the alopecia part of the study, subjects were classified as to whether they ever have received prescriptions for finasteride or whether they were never treated with finasteride. So what these investigators were looking for was whether being on a 5-AR inhibiting drug increased the risk of getting erectile dysfunction. The investigators present their results in 8 very detailed tables such as this one here, but let's summarize the results more simply. First, let's take a look at erectile dysfunction in men with BPH. Surprisingly, the incidence of erectile dysfunction was lowest in men taking 5-AR inhibitors, with an incidence of 15.3 cases per 1,000 person years versus 19.2 cases per 1,000 person years with the combination of 5-AR inhibitors plus alpha blockers, and 20.1 cases per 1,000 person years with alpha blockers alone. Now you're probably wondering, what the hell is a person year? Well, basically it's a unit of measurement epidemiologists like to use. You can kind of think of it like if there were over 1,000 men, there would be 15.3 cases of erectile dysfunction in a year while taking a 5-AR inhibiting drug. But you can also look at it in other ways as long as you multiply the number of persons and the number of years together and get 1,000. So if you had 100 men, you would see 15.3 cases over a 10-year period if they were on a 5-AR inhibiting drug. Anyways, there was no real control group in the BPH part of the study, but it did not appear that 5-AR inhibiting drugs increased the risk of erectile dysfunction over alpha blockers, which are not known to cause erectile dysfunction by themselves. One thing that did increase the risk of erectile dysfunction was how many years the men had suffered from BPH, which suggests that erectile dysfunction is a function of BPH itself rather than the drugs used for it. And this makes perfect sense because BPH is actually known to cause erectile dysfunction. But let's go ahead and turn to the population that is most relevant to the concerns for viewers of this channel, men with hair loss. In that population, there were 547 cases of erectile dysfunction out of a total of 12,346 men. As you would expect, the incidence of erectile dysfunction in younger men without BPH was lower than in the men with BPH. For men on finasteride at 1 milligram per day, the incidence of erectile dysfunction was 10.1 cases per 1,000 person years. For men not taking finasteride, the incidence was 9.8 cases per 1,000 person years. This slight difference was not statistically significant, meaning there was no appreciable increase in the incidence of erectile dysfunction in men with alopecia who took finasteride versus those who didn't. Now, the authors did a number of sub-analyses, but none of these analyses changed their basic conclusions. Their conclusions were, quote, "The results of our study provide evidence that 5-alpha reductase inhibitors do not increase the risk of clinically meaningful incident erectile dysfunction in men who are free of sexual dysfunction and major risk factors regardless of indication for use," unquote. The authors further concluded that, quote, "Since benign prostatic hyperplasia and alopecia are common conditions in men and 5-alpha reductase inhibitors are primary drug treatments for these conditions, the results of the study provide reassurance that these drugs are not associated with a materially important increased risk of clinically meaningful erectile dysfunction in everyday clinical practice," unquote. The second study of this epic trilogy was published in 2017 and is titled, quote, "Risk of incident antidepressant-treated depression associated with use of 5-alpha reductase inhibitors compared with use of alpha blockers in men with benign prostatic hyperplasia, a population-based study using Clinical Practice Research Datalink," unquote. The study had the same design as the previous study, but it only looked at men with BPH, not androgenic alopecia. The results show that men treated with 5-AR blockers alone, the risk of depression was 7.6 cases per 1,000 person years. For men treated with a combination of 5-AR blockers and alpha blockers, the risk was 6.1 cases per 1,000 person years. Finally, for men treated with just alpha blockers alone, the risk was 7.8 cases per 1,000 person years. So, even though the numbers are slightly different, they are not statistically different, meaning that 5-AR blockers did not increase the risk of depression compared to alpha blockers. There is good evidence that alpha blockers themselves don't cause depression at all, and I'll link the articles on that subject below. But the bottom line here was that there was no evidence that 5-AR inhibitors cause depression in BPH patients. So, the study concluded that, quote, "In this population of men treated with BPH, use of 5-AR inhibitors alone or in combination with alpha blockers did not increase the risk of incident antidepressant-treated depression compared with use of alpha blockers only. Risk of treated depression increased with longer duration of BPH," unquote. So finally, the conclusion for this trilogy, part 3, is this article here, also published in 2017. Once again, the same methods were used, and once again, they are just looking at men with BPH. This time, though, they were looking at the incidence of gynecomastia in breast cancer. This time, they had 94,701 men with BPH. Looking at the incidence of gynecomastia, there were 40.2 cases per 10,000 person years for 5-AR users versus 12.2 cases per 10,000 person years for alpha blocker users. And this time, they also included men not treated at all. Untreated men had an incidence of gynecomastia of 7.2 cases per 10,000 person years. So, before you get too worried that these numbers seem higher than the risk of erectile dysfunction or depression in the other studies, they're actually not. In this study, the investigators are using units of 10,000 person years, not 1,000 person years like in the other studies. So, if you convert these numbers to the units used in the other studies, the incidence of gyno on 5-AR blockers would be 4 cases per 1,000 person years and 0.7 cases per 1,000 person years for untreated subjects. But even though these incidences are low, the differences are still statistically significant. 5-AR blockers in this patient population group increased the risk of gynecomastia by 3.55 times. Fortunately, though, there was no no increased risk of male breast cancer with either 5-AR inhibitors or alpha blockers compared to untreated subjects. So these are the 3 studies that Mark Montagna is complaining about, though actually he is only complaining about the 2 studies that showed negative results, the erectile dysfunction study and the depression study. So he's willing to accept the results of the gyno study since it fits his narrative that finasteride is poisonous, even though that study used the exact same methodology as the other 2 studies. This guy has zero scientific integrity. So what are his objections exactly? Well, his main objection is that many of the cases of erectile dysfunction occurred in people who had quit taking finasteride months or years before their symptoms occurred. Well, that's pretty incredible logic coming from someone who believes in post-finasteride syndrome, which makes the claim that sexual side effects can occur months or even years or even indefinitely after stopping the drug. In fact, if you took out those cases, it would make the incidence of erectile dysfunction even lower in the study. He even makes this point explicitly saying, quote, "Consider a patient who stopped finasteride a year ago and then developed new erectile dysfunction unrelated to prior use of the drug. He would be counted as an erectile dysfunction case in the finasteride group," unquote. But then he tries to have it both ways. He says, quote, "Consider a patient who had erectile dysfunction related to finasteride but stopped 6 months ago and their erectile dysfunction resolved. He would be counted as a non-case in the study. This is a miss," unquote. No, it would only be considered a non-case if the erectile dysfunction wasn't reported to his doctor, which would presumably be a mild case. Cases like that could also happen in the subjects not treated with finasteride, and they wouldn't be picked up in the database either. He then makes the point that younger men with alopecia might be more embarrassed to report erectile dysfunction than older men. However, the study also looked at older men with BPH, and the same results were seen. 5-AR blockers did not increase the incidence of erectile dysfunction. He brings up that men might have been getting their finasteride from other sources during the study and not reporting it to their doctors. However, if that were true, it would likely occur in patients who supposedly quit finasteride in the study based on the date of the last prescription written by the patient's general practitioner. After their doctors prescribe finasteride, it is reasonable that some men might seek out cheaper sources for the drug. So a lot of the men who are listed in the database as no longer on finasteride could very likely still be on the drug. None of that would change the classification of these patients as being on finasteride or not. Finally, he complains that one of the co-authors of the study, Dr. Nickel, was a participant in the original studies of finasteride as a treatment for BPH back in the 1990s. These studies were done 20 years before the 3 studies we went over today, so I very much doubt this is a realistic conflict of interest. Also, Mr. Montagna mentions a patent that Dr. Nickel holds that was assigned to Merck and Temple University. It is a treatment for chronic prostatitis that is not related to finasteride. This is a pretty lame criticism of the studies we just presented, and considering Mr. Montagna has basically made it his life's goal to slander finasteride at any cost, he's in no position to accuse anyone else of having a conflict of interest. His whole life is literally just bashing finasteride. On that note, Mr. Montagna makes the same arguments against the depression study, so we really don't need to go over them again. So like I said earlier in the video, these arguments Mr. Montagna is making aren't even his own arguments. He just stole them from Dr. Richard Brown. Just after the erectile dysfunction article was published, Dr. Richard Brown wrote a letter responding to the article. In the letter, he raises the same concerns about the small number of men in the alopecia part of the study who were considered current users of finasteride, as well as raising the possibility that some of the men might have been getting the drug privately. He doesn't bring up the bogus conflict of interest claims that Mr. Montagna makes, but other than that, Mr. Montagna used Dr. Brown's arguments practically verbatim, and he doesn't give him any credit for it. Dr. Hagberg, the first author of the study, responded to Dr. Brown's letter. She notes that missing cases would occur in both users and non-users of finasteride, so it would be unlikely to affect the results. She also notes that although some men may have never reported their finasteride use, if the men ever received even a single prescription of finasteride from their doctor and then got it later from private sources, they would still be counted in the finasteride group. She also notes that even if 50% of the cases were misclassified, the results still ended up showing no increased erectile dysfunction with finasteride use. Finally, although the actual numbers of men with erectile dysfunction were low, the study group with alopecia was quite large, 12,346 men. The fact that the incidence of erectile dysfunction was so low is actually very reassuring, since it implies that finasteride is not associated with a large risk of erectile dysfunction. Also, also, the results were confirmed in the even larger group of men with BPH in the same study. So what's my take on all this? Well, no study is perfect, of course, and database studies are not as good as randomized controlled studies. I put more faith in the randomized control studies of finasteride for androgenetic alopecia, where the risk of sexual side effects was about 4% in men on finasteride versus 2% on placebo, which is still a very slight difference. But these database studies are nevertheless valuable too, because they represent the real world, and also men with previous histories of sexual problems were excluded from these studies, unlike in the randomized clinical trials. So this data does indicate that the risk of erectile dysfunction is low in men who are being treated for androgenetic alopecia with 1 milligram of finasteride per day who don't have a previous history of sexual problems. We also know that in most of the controlled studies, the risk of side effects was highest in the first year, and the risk diminished afterwards to become comparable to the risk of side effects from placebo treatments. So usually, the sexual side effects from finasteride are just due to changes in the testosterone to estrogen ratio, which can get better by itself with continued use of the drug, as it often does, and I did a video on that subject, which I'll link below. There is one other very important point, though, from these database studies that I think everyone, including Mr. Montagna, has missed. Mr. Montagna noted that the majority of men in both studies were previous users of finasteride and not current users. It turns out that in these studies, the incidence of erectile dysfunction and of depression in previous users of finasteride was the same as in non-users of finasteride. This is actually very, very strong evidence that post-finasteride syndrome does not exist. If post-finasteride syndrome was actually a real thing, one would expect the incidence of erectile dysfunction and depression to be higher in men who had ever used finasteride at any time in the past. But the incidence of erectile dysfunction and depression was the same, regardless of whether a subject had ever taken finasteride or if they had never taken finasteride. In today's environment of finasteride fear-mongering, which is so prevalent online, anyone who gets erectile dysfunction or depression and who took finasteride at some point in the past would call it post-finasteride syndrome. But these database studies suggest that you are equally likely to get erectile dysfunction or depression whether you have taken finasteride or not. The fact is that both erectile dysfunction and depression are extremely common diseases, but people who get them who have also once used finasteride at any point of their lives, even years before, can now blame their diseases on finasteride. But this is completely unwarranted, and these studies back that up. So that's my whole take on this trilogy of studies that provide supporting evidence that the risk of side effects from finasteride is very, very low, and post-finasteride syndrome is, of course, a fake syndrome. That's why you don't see any academic interest in this subject anymore, and the only people who even still talk about it are basically just a handful of angry Redditors who create dozens of sock puppet accounts in order to spam the same lazy anecdotes over and over again. Alright, so I've got more content coming up soon. Thank you for watching. God bless.